Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 19th of May 2014, Mike Spencer discussed neuroscience and the notion of the self.
Thank you. So, I'll get straight into it. It's such a huge subject, so I'm going to have to be quite brutal in cutting down to some points I want to make. A pretty consistent idea of the self as a substantial, fully self-conscious, self-contained I, which is complete in command of its own destiny. However, when we look at the brain, there's nothing there. No substance, no chemical, no quantum particle or field that accounts for consciousness. And yet there we are looking into our own brains, and we cannot deny the power of experience and awareness and the sense of being immersed in the world. So the standard formula of debate around consciousness, this is banging against there, isn't it? The standard formula is the idea of bridging the gap, usually between these two disparate realities, as it were. And this gap is often reformulated as the same gap between the humanities and the hard sciences. And it's even reflected in the geographical divide between British analytical philosophy and continental phenomenology. With this in mind, it's my intention to start off with a continental analytical philosopher, thus hopefully aggravating everyone in the audience in one fell swoop. Now, some commentators are beginning to ask if the solution to the problem is not in fact to bridge the gap, but rather to understand what the gap is, to reformulate it. Why? Because the proposition is that consciousness itself depends on the gap, on a certain kind of blindness, which separates us from raw nature. Now, I want to look at one of the many neurologically based theories of consciousness, just as a start-off, and a notion of body-based self, before I'll then take the leap to propose how that self exists in the context of relationships with other selves. I'm going to declare from the start, as Joel already mentioned, that I'm heavily influenced by the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who is known as a sort of a celebrity philosopher, which is this facade, this game that he and everyone else plays along. But behind that, Žižek is recognized as a world authority on Hegel and Kant. He teaches at the Birkbeck Institute and at the European Graduate School. And he's respected by pretty substantial philosophers like Alain Badiou in France and others. So there's a lot of metaphysics behind what he expounds publicly. And we don't often hear that because it's metaphysical, unsurprisingly. Right. So I'm going to, my basic stance is one introduced by Žižek, really, but I leave Žižek and I go off into other philosophers as well, and then put that together with my own experiences and those of my friends as well in the MPS, in the Philosophical Society. So let's kick off. With our continental analytical philosopher is a guy called Professor Thomas Metzinger, who oversees a research program spanning many disciplines, from neuroscience to cognitive science, neuropsychology and psychiatry, to artificial intelligence and evolutionary robotics. All these disciplines ultimately see the brain as a complex information processing system that produces neural maps or models of its environment and ultimately of itself. So Metzinger's main question is to ask how, in principle, could a consciously experienced self and a genuine first-person perspective emerge from such a complex system in the first place? And the proposition is that the brain receives data from the senses, but is unable to access the processing mechanism itself, the sensory data, the nervous system, the chemical interactions, and so on that facilitate that experience. So basically, if I saw a tiger out there trying to get in, I'm not going to stand here and shout, okay, I'm perceiving sensory data coming in through my optic nerve, which is kicking off chemical reactions, and forming a neural map of what appears to be a predator, I'm going to shout, tiger, and you're going to know exactly what I mean. And the point is that immediate experience of what constitutes our raw reality, even though what we're seeing is a representation. It's a delay. Even in time, it's a delay from the actual events outside. Now, Metzinger believes that the complexity needed to have the kind of level of awareness that we would need to be able to see the processing data or the processing system is too much. It would slow us down. We wouldn't be able to operate in the world. So there's a huge advantage, evolutionary advantage, to experience reality as unmediated, as direct. But that's the point. It appears as raw reality because the process that led to it are transparent. And here Metzinger means transparency in a special way. He means it as a special form of darkness. We're not able to see something because we appear to see through it. And this is one particular formation of the gap as to why the gap is important to consciousness. So consciousness depends on a kind of blindness, and that blindness is what helps us to be immersed in the world, and yet sense ourselves as separate at the same time. Now, Kant says as much originally, hundreds of years ago, essentially saying that the non-substantial character of the subject needed to have ignorance of its noumenal nature, he called it, in order for consciousness to exist. So there's nothing particularly new in Metzinger, except that there's a neural model, a mapping system to explain it. But where it does get interesting is when he turns this understanding of conscious experience of the world out there onto our experience as selves within what he calls the phenomenological self model, or the PSM. Just to mention, this blindness to the system that we have, he calls, which is a term I like, auto-epistemic closure, which is the automatic built-in of lack of certain types of knowledge, sensory data as sensory data, in order to experience reality as we do. So to experience reality, it's not that we only see limited data. It's not that we see all the data. Consciousness depends on limit, not on excess. Okay, so hopefully so far so good. So if we take the phenomenal self model and apply it to what we might imagine the life would be for a fetus inside, maybe still inside the womb, or maybe a young infant outside, but with the most basic levels of neural connections in the young brain. Blood beats rhythmically in the arteries around the inner ear, the heart beats in the chest, skin, muscles, limb and joints and viscera all send data to the brain, and gradually over time and repetition, the brain begins to form maps of the body and forms what's called proprioception, which is kind of an internal understanding that arms are here and legs are there. Now, the baby wouldn't have concepts for those yet, but if I ask any of you now, without thinking about it, you know where your arms are. It's a pre-conscious or pre-conceptual level of awareness. So like the tiger example, the experience of the body is also mediated through a neural map. But again, it's not experienced as an internal construct, but as something that is irrevocably real. Now, in short, and this is the crucial point, in short, the system models itself and then mistakes the model for itself directly. So the brain forms a map of itself, looks at that and goes, that's me. That's the basis of the PSM model. Now, because the sense of viscerality and liveness to our experience is constant, it's because there is an endless stream of data which is always updating and challenging and meeting that map. So that's why we have the sensation that we are always here, consistently. Now, Metzinger insists that any such model has to be anchored firmly in the body dynamics, including those especially of elementary bioregulation. Now, as it happens, he shares this view with the eminent French philosopher Merleau-Ponty, who 50 years ago or so emphasized the body as the primary site of knowing the world, and maintained that the body and that which it perceived could not be disentangled from each other, which an idea at the time was quite in tension with the long philosophical tradition of placing consciousness as the source of knowledge, as opposed to the body as the source of knowledge. Now the question is how do we get from this PSM, this phenomenological self-model, to full selfhood proper, the complex sense of who I am and what I am in the world that we generally experience as human beings? Now here Metzinger makes a leap, and that's when language appears for him. The self-modeling process shifts gear, as it were, and uses this new representational content to attribute phenomenal states to our perceived objects and ourselves, enabling us to properly reflect on ourselves. I'm cold, I'm hungry, I like that sound, this person is happy, and so on. Now, I think this is about as far we can go with Metzinger. As his argument progresses, it takes no account of the relational basis of language at all. My history is in linguistics, and very clear from any first student of linguistics, first year, language is totally socially based. It depends on an agreement between people. So it's very much a social system. Now, beyond proprioception, the body's preconceptual image of itself, beyond this into broader self-modeling, are not just maps that somehow spontaneously appear within the human, within the child, initiated by us, but are ideas about the world given to us by our parents and our siblings, and school teachers and friends, and ultimately by society at large, which are then negotiated apparently with our own experiences of the world. That assumes that the two can be separated, that there is an authentic personal first-hand experience that is not mediated by language, which itself is social. So there's a slight dilemma there. But before moving on from Metzinger, I do want to quote one part of one of his lectures, which is quite nice. He says, "Of course, you don't see with your eyes. I hope none of you believe that. You see with your visual system. But on the user surface, so to speak, on the top level, there is this abbreviated short story. The system tells itself that it sees with its eyes, and it creates this little avatar, the PSM. The avatar doesn't know it has a visual cortex. It just sees with its eyes. It doesn't know it has a motor cortex. It just acts with its hands. Given all this, isn't it true that the self is an illusion? I think that it is not, because it contains a logical mistake. On the level of which we are talking, there is no such thing as truth and falsity yet. There is no body that can have an illusion in this system. So if you really wanted to stay with the idea that the self is an illusion, you have to say that it is an illusion that is no one's illusion. It is true. If it is true that the self is not a thing but a process, as I've described, then it is also true that the tragedy of the ego dissolves, because strictly speaking, nobody is ever born and nobody ever dies." It's a pretty bold statement from Metzinger. I like it. I think it's a lovely thought, but it does lend itself rather well to eugenics, possibly, and other far-right political philosophies. But anyhow, I think it's a very interesting approach. I don't really want to go into Descartes' cogito other than to say that the cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, is seen as the starting point of the modern history of consciousness. But it does play with this idea that I can't trust what I perceive, but I know that I'm perceiving it. Or I doubt that I'm perceiving it, but I know that I doubt. So it ends up, the long and the short, that I think therefore I am. There's lots of criticisms against this, including the simple one by Nietzsche, that says that doesn't mean there's any doer behind the action. One could just as easily say that it thinks, in the same way one says that it rains. Kierkegaard suggested that the proper logical flow of argument is that existence is already assumed or presupposed in order for thinking to occur, not that existence is concluded from thinking. Anyway, so Slavoj Žižek, here we go, while a supporter of Metzinger and his modelling up to a point, takes him to task on his final conclusion that the self is an illusion. that if it's an illusion, it's no one's illusion. And he points out that illusion can mean something else, as with a magic trick. It's not that something doesn't exist, it's just that it doesn't exist where we think it is, or in the form that we think it is. So existence doesn't necessarily have to equate with raw empirical reality for Zizek. The problem he sees is that while what the observer immediately identifies with is the experience of self-awareness is a fiction, something with no positive ontological status, his very act of observing is a positive ontological fact. If you take Metzinger's argument as a version of Plato's cave argument, in this version, the cave itself is the brain, and its neural processes, is the brain, the system, the neural processes that go on. And it projects an image of itself onto the cave, but this is the crucial point. It also projects or generates or simulates an observer, what Metzinger calls an avatar. If you play any computer games, anybody, you'll be familiar with that you have somebody that stands in for yourself, and you exist in the computer game through that avatar. Well, Metzinger says that's what goes on with us. The self is an avatar. It's the same principle. Now, this opens up a whole world of problems, which is which the most common one is that how is it that there is an act of observation but no actual observer? Appearance cannot appear to another appearance. The shadows cannot appear to what is effectively another shadow, Metzinger's avatar. But it also cannot appear to a reality itself, the system of the brain directly, because there is no subject there to be the observer. Zizek's approach is that we need a third virtual term, and that is this. It starts to get quite metaphysical here. The subject is a non-phenomenal support of appearance. Our self is this void itself. Its core is not some positive content, but the self-relating negativity is a phrase for you, which is a very Hegelian term. Negation, self-negation, negation of a negation is something that Hegel loves to play with, and it can really cause you a lot of problems if you get too stuck in it. But there's something in it. So ultimately, the only association I can make with the idea of self-relating negativity is the idea that ultimately we can define something, ultimately we can define things by what they're not. So if we look at a cup on a table, let's say, I can define that cup ultimately by saying it's not the bottle, it's not the pen there, it's not the other implements on the table, it's not the keys, and so on and so forth. Once I've done all that, all that's left is the space for the cup. So the cup doesn't, in a sense, have to have a positive ontological existence. Sometimes I get that, and sometimes I lose it. But this is the whole fulcrum around the entire metaphysical proposition that Zizek depends upon. Okay, so as a mind experiment, if we did the same with an imagined, and it is an imagined, totality of reality, we just try and name everything. What is left is just a void, the void that allows the act of naming to happen in the first place. It cannot name itself, for it is the place of non-existence that, if you like, existence appears to. So whereas most readers think of the cogito as this fully self-conscious I, complete in command of its destiny and so on and so forth, Zizek does believe in the cogito. He calls himself a Descartes supporter, but he says the cogito is a void. It's an empty space, which is what is left when the rest of the world is expelled from itself. It is not, therefore, a part of reality, positive ontological reality. Yet it is something that exists, and here's the crux, for another self. A subject exists only for another subject. That is, there is no subject for an external objective view. And I believe so much was said by Fichte a couple of hundred years ago, and others, that the subject only appears to the subject. But it's nice to hear in such a modern context with such a modern take on it. So I think that's a very profound proposition, and I think it takes some offbeat thinking to grasp it. And I think there's a subtlety there. It's like the difference between saying there is not a self and the self is not. Two different things. So the self has a negative ontological status. It is nothing that exists as nothing. And with no place in concrete reality, it's never going to be found by science. No one's ever going to find some kind of quantum field, some kind of special place or particle in which consciousness resides. So the complexity of this problem actually is helped a little bit by Zizek, I think, with his next move, which is to say that in order to account for subjectivity, we need to therefore problematize the standard opposition between appearance and reality, the sense in which we see appearance as mere appearance, as a second-order inferior representation of a substantial, ontological, positive and superior reality out there. In other words, we've got to change this idea that the shadows on Plato's caves are mere flickers and reality is outside through the opening. So what he says here, we need to accept what he calls, I'm going to quote him directly here, we need to accept the embarrassing paradox encountered by the 20th century hard sciences in, among others, quantum physics. The appearance, perception of a particle determines its reality. The very emergence of hard reality out of the quantum fluctuation through the collapse of the wave function is the outcome of observation, of the intervention of consciousness. This notion of the ontological superiority of appearances is, I accept, quite a difficult one to grasp, especially for traditional materialists and empiricists and the like, not for idealists, of course, someone like Joel, I'm sure, Roy. And yet, it happens. All evidence suggests it happens. And it's scientifically pretty commonplace, pretty shared now, this idea. For example, it's quite easy to find Lord Rees, the Royal Astronomer of the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge. I think we see him on TV occasionally. He says, to quote him, "The universe could only come into existence if someone observed it. It does not matter that the observers turned up several billion years later. The universe exists because we are aware of it." So with this in mind, you can't help but play with the cogito ergo sum and swap it around in the sense that if the universe exists because we see it, I exist because you see me, and you exist because I see you. So you could change from I think, therefore I am to you think, therefore I am. Or I think, and therefore you are. Isn't this close, for those of you who are familiar with Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas, that his stance is that the other takes priority, is prior to the self. Now, isn't this the case for mothers, or those of us with children, small children, that by cooing and playing with the child and having this sort of calling to it, repeating its name and the like, you're kind of willing the child, unbeknownst to you, into selfhood. You're trying to will the child to come out and to see you, and in so doing, to appear, to see itself. The suggestion is that before the baby recognizes itself as a self, it has to see the other first. Now, you could say that the two suddenly happen, one happens after the other, but still, nevertheless, the primacy is the baby as observer that then recognizes itself as being seen. So effectively, at a certain stage of development, it recognizes the mother or significant carer as a coherent whole, is the usual argument, and that other gazes back, and in so doing, calling the child, in the mother's gaze, the child sees that it is seen as an object, At some stage, perhaps at that moment, the child recognizes itself as that object in the other's gaze, and this is a self symbolically generated to fulfill that gaze, to complete it. And it's only because the child eventually is able to hold the idea of its mother when she's not physically there, internalize her gaze, that the self is able to persist when alone. So I come back to that phrase, the self-relating negativity. I hope that informs it a little bit, in the sense that when the baby hears a name called, it expels everything else from the world, and what's left, the empty space from which it is looking back at its mother, must be itself. So for Metzinger, the proper internalization of the other's gaze can only happen when the other appears, and then the child can form a proper phenomenological self-map based on concepts, courtesy of the move into language. The concept of self and other is a concept. It's not something that we appear to be born with, it's something that appears to us. For the philosopher-psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, the notorious Jacques Lacan to some, this would be the mirror stage of development, when the infant is able to recognize themselves in a mirror or other symbolic contraption, including the eyes of another person, in the sense that they know something is being looked at. And this is the birth of apperception, the turning of oneself into an object that can be viewed from outside. Now, Lacan held that the ego is the product of misunderstanding, a false recognition, just as Metzinger does. Additionally, the mirror stage is where the subject becomes alienated from itself and is thus introduced into what he calls the imaginary order. It moves from a preconceptual I, if you like, in the unconscious, the normal sense of that I, the sense of an I existing without saying I am something. It moves from that to I am that as a conscious self. I am that which is being looked at. Eventually, I am baby, that's mother. The ability to say I am that splits the subject into the one that speaks, and yet at the same time, the one that is spoken of. That's quite a profound thing. It's called, for Lacan calls it the subject of the enunciation and the subject of the enunciated. So I'm going to the shops. Now you will understand that I'm putting I out there. Myself as I am going to the shops, but I'm also the one who's speaking. And how we reconcile those two is a task, and frequently it doesn't happen. And some people say that's the basis for some mental illnesses, poor developmental stages and the like. To quote Lacan briefly again, in pronouncing a word, usually the self, I'm going to the shops, the subject contracts his being outside of himself. He coagulates the core of his being into an external sign. In the verbal sign, I, as it were, I find myself outside myself. I posit my unity outside myself in a signifier that represents me. This self as object provides the framework for the ego, and it's then just a case of filling it in with content. The question to come will be whose content is it that fills that space? Are our self-concepts our own, or just variations of those given to us by, some would say imposed on us by society or by our parents and teachers, and so on and so forth? Now this process, as I've established, I think really, of observation bringing the self into existence, observation by the other bringing the self into existence, cannot be initially self-instigated. It's pretty well established that normal child development depends very much on adequate interaction with other human beings. Children who aren't exposed to this normal level of interaction especially tend to suffer some kind of, not always, some predictable, but tend to suffer developmental failure. Feral children is a popular one occasionally. The story of a feral child, a child who was brought up by wolves or what have you in the forest comes up. And although they're quite unreliable, a lot of the stories, the general agreement is that most of these children have a very problematic notion of the self and the other, tend not to have entered into language because they've left before language developed too much. I myself used to be a psychiatric sector nurse many years ago, and I worked with many children and adults who had been severely environmentally and socially deprived, and it was blatantly obvious. You could see that those children and adults had a serious problem separating the world into selves. Not unusual for people with levels of autism, for instance, to genetic or environmentally caused, doesn't matter. They often refer to themselves in the third person. Michael's going to the shops, which is quite an insight into the idea that they haven't formed these object relations, the self as an object, or they have, but they can't then relate it back to the I. And the argument is you could say that the autistic child who might be seen as psychotic is actually the one who speaks the truth, from Metziger's point of view, to say Michael's going to the shops. To say I am going to the shop and separate myself is to cover over a gap, which you could argue is a form of psychosis. It's just an interesting question. Now, Hegel, the notorious Hegel for some, but not for others, developed the notion of relationship as the basis for self-consciousness, and he developed this into the idea of the master-slave dialectic, which is a very influential concept, which gave birth ultimately to Freudian psychoanalysis and the like. I won't go into it, it's quite a complex thing, but it's more accurately translated as lordship and bondage. But it's interesting to note that the German word for self-consciousness that Hegel used is, now I'm going to try my pronunciation here, is Selbstbewusstsein. Bewusstsein. Thank you. Okay, that wasn't bad then, was it? Thank you. Now, my understanding is that also has the sense of being self-assured, unlike the English word, which is associated with embarrassment and hesitation. Self-consciousness means a slightly different thing. And I find that fascinating, that on some level perhaps without realizing it, in order to feel we properly exist, we need acknowledgement that we are seen to exist. We certainly, on the surface of things, seem to have a lower sense of self-worth when we are embarrassed or hesitant, as if we fall apart, and in a sense we do, as our mask of control and calm collapses. Now, reification is a lovely word for this kind of thing, which is the idea to regard or treat an abstraction as if it had a concrete or material existence. For instance, we imbue Apple products, the iPhone, and so on and so forth, with a certain spirit, a design spirit, Steve Jobs, or something magical, magical X, an unknown quantity. And we put that X in the object, as if the object itself then becomes reified. The abstract becomes reified and manifest in the world. And we do the same frequently for many other objects. Now, what adds an edge to the concept of reification is the placebo effect of medications. 2 headache pills identical in chemical composition, but the first one is packaged in generic packaging, the second one is packaged in a brand product that people recognize and trust. The second one works better than the first. It's a well-documented empirical fact. And it works even with medication that can be objectively measured, as opposed to just a subjective interpretation of a headache. So that's another interesting example of the ontological superiority of appearances. So it's not just in quantum mechanics, it's appearing, as it were, in medical psychology. The question is that is not also, to some degree, this is what we do with the self. We reify ourselves and each other. Zizek uses the notion of the photon that has no mass until it has a spin. It is only potential until it emerges through its clinamen, the spin of the atom, for instance, or the sudden deviation, its expression. There is no substantial something prior to its appearance as a spin or acceleration. Its existence is in those characteristics. For the self as a void, in its normal state, it is nothing. In and of itself. It needs, as it were, a spin to exist. And then, and that spin is what gives it recognition, visibility. Now, in this case, it's what Lacan would call within what he called the symbolic order of social authority. And that's, he has these three orders, which I won't go into, but the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. But the symbolic includes language in it, but it's not reduced to language. But the idea is that we need to exist in a world of symbols and concepts that we can be seen to fit into. What he calls the big other, that which we hold ourselves accountable as reality or the truth or the like. The social authority, to bring ourselves into the realm of existence for other selves, to have some mass, as it were, in society at large, including in the family even. I cannot exist as just I or an am. I need to be turned into a thing, as it were, a son, a father, a mother or a brother, a policeman, an environmentalist, a teacher, a rebel, even a rebel. Those that say we don't live outside of society, who say they do, still need to be called to do so. You could argue that the true rebels are the ones who aren't named, the ones you don't see. Now, that idea that the one who truly stands out of society is invisible to it lends itself well to the idea that there are two kinds of death. The first, of course, is the death of the body, but the other is the symbolic death, when we cease to exist for other people, when our name is spoken for the last time, or when we have no status whatsoever. In the West, such people will be demonized or put in prison or publicly humiliated. In Stalinist Russia, for instance, they were removed altogether from history, erased from photographs and all records. One of the ways we enact a symbolic death is not to recognize the other's experiences as real, not to see their experiences as concrete, and therefore, in a way, they become falsehoods. They sort of they're no longer real people. If someone doesn't believe us, we feel assaulted, as if we mean less, are worth less. One of the greatest fears of survivors of the Holocaust was that they would not be believed. An anecdote from the Bosnian War in the early 1990s makes the point quite well. Many of the girls who survived brutal rapes later killed themselves, having rejoined their community, only to find that no one was ready to listen to them, to accept their testimony. It seems as if for us to exist, we have to be seen to exist, and if our experiences are not acknowledged, we suffer. This is the trauma of madness, that the madman, as a concept, is excluded from society, delegitimized, and is why it serves as such a useful tool of political exclusion, to reduce someone to a mental state, as it were. The women from the Bosnian War were seen as hysterical, others seen as fanatical or delusional. Let's just look at madness for a second. Lacan held quite a nice proverb, if you like, that a man who thinks he is king is mad. A man on the street who thinks he's king is mad. But the king who thinks he is a king is no less mad. The point is that a king is only a king by his subjects because his subjects loyally think and act like he is king. He's there by agreement. The king who is not crazy creates some distance between himself and his role of king. He understands how things work by agreement. He distances himself from this social construct, the symbolic authority that allows him to act as king. But is not the same thing true for instance, the policeman who believes he is a policeman and fails to see himself anymore as a public servant? A teacher who believes they are a teacher and are unable to see the child in front of them as anything other than a pupil whose value is measured by their grades, as something that interrupts the class or not, good or bad. Is it not the same for even the modern notion that holds the self as sovereign? Is not the modern self an over-identification with Descartes' cogito, the historical idea of the self as a fully self-conscious, self-contained I, which is in complete command of its destiny? Is this not effectively the internalized idea of a king? That I am the ruler of myself, existing independently of relationships, even to the point of holding moral authority to judge others. Is this not a kind of madness too? I think this sovereignty of the self is a kind of tyranny as well, an act of bad faith, Jean-Paul Sartre might say, inauthentic. He used to argue that, his argument was that the waiter who served people and believed they were a waiter, the server in France and Paris, would be very much present as a server, as a waiter. And he'd call that an inauthentic act, because they believed they were the role that they were playing. An over-identification that is perhaps at the root of so many modern problems, possibly. The question then is the idea of the modern autonomous self a role that we can distance ourselves from, something we can allow ourselves to see as a construct of a society that wants to know what it is, and is accepted all too ready by us in order for us to be able to move in society, for society to see us. If we are able to transcend this idea of ourselves, what happens to the self? What if the ego is a defense mechanism, not so much a defending mediator between primitive drives within social pressures, primitive drives within and social pressures without, which is the traditional Freudian idea that we're all animals, crazy prehistoric creatures, and morals and ethics from outside have to calm us down, and the ego forms to mediate between the two. But what if that the ego is a defense, actually, against the fear of non-existence? That when we look inside, at times we fall into the abyss, what Zizek calls the unbearable lightness of being no one. And maybe at other times when the sensation of the self does reside within us, but this might be another kind of illusion, in the sense of something not being where we think it is. And maybe this is like the special kind of darkness that enables the experience of the tiger as unmediated. What if there is a special kind of darkness too in the transparency of social relations that mean we are unable to see the social processes that mediate ourselves, the relationships in which the self resides? Instead, we see, like the tiger, the immediate sense of self within. What if the self isn't there? What if the illusion is that it is out there? What happens when we refuse the roles we play? The teacher, the pupil, the therapist, the patient, the oppressor and the victim. Can we not, after all, as Metzinger suggests, let the ego dissolve? What would it look like to lose the sense of self as residing within? Would it be to cease to exist, or would it actually be to come into existence in the full realization that myself exists, exists, in the encounter with the other? Isn't this what we mean when we say, I lost myself in something? A play, a piece of art, or another person? It doesn't mean that the self no longer exists. It means that we're lost in it. In the very thing we are seeing, in the act of seeing, we see something. The other that takes the ontological primacy over the self. When a mother looks into her infant's face, she loses herself in the power of the face-to-face encounter itself. And the infant self starts off in the mother's gaze. Now, the primacy of the face-to-face relation is a concept held by Emmanuel Levinas again, who also granted, as I said before, I think, the ontological primacy of the other over the self, and the other always preceding the self, as I say. Now, the proposition is the authentic self, therefore, the one who refuses egotistical self-reflection and becomes the act of observing itself, without placing an ego between themselves and the other they are looking at. I want to give just one example of what just such an encounter might look like. There's a thing called the fear-shame dynamic, which is a popular concept for couple counseling. And the idea is that during a heated discussion, one partner hears something that scares them, they get angry, and this causes the other to express disapproval and distress. That causes a sense of shame in the first partner and feeds their anger even more, resulting in a feedback loop, and the situation just escalates rapidly. For the angry partner, it's not that there is a self that feels shame. The self maps itself as shame. It identifies with itself with what it is called to feel by the other person, guilt. The angry partner over-identifies with the guilt. They are struggling with their presence in the world already, and now they become dismissed completely as an ethical failure, and now all is lost, and the centre cannot hold, as the poem goes. If the responding partner can see the anger in the other as distress or fear, rather than an insult to one's ego, I'm not the kind of person who should be shouted at, and so on and so forth, then the dynamic is broken. For this to happen, the responding partner needs to drop their idea of themselves as nobody's fool, for instance, or the idea that I have a right not to be shouted at. Are they then defenseless? Do they suddenly cease to exist? What usually happens is, as I say, the situation is diffused and transformed instead into one of sudden possibilities. Is this not exactly what Nelson Mandela did in refusing to be the victim of the prison system, refusing to be the oppressed prisoner, refusing to see his guards as his oppressors? In doing so, while he remained in a physical jail, he opened the symbolic cell door that separated his captors and managed to enter into a proper, authentic relationship with his guards that lasted right up until his death. Did he cease to exist? Or did he transcend what I would call the simple, stupid level of reality in which the ego normally resides as we see it? In both these scenarios, which outcome would we consider as having the potential for proper relationship? Defended selves within the within competing for separate existence, or as Plato invited, a lover and a loved, where one person contains the other, both in the sense of protecting them and in the sense of residing within, seeing themselves in the other and the other in themselves. That's it. Thank you.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.